One of the most infamous scalawags to sail the seven seas of the interwebs is the dreaded Jean-David Nau, better known as François l'Olonnais. A frequent in articles and YouTube videos alike, he is always cited among the cruelest pirates to have ever existed, if not outright topping the scar list of purported depravities. According to the traditional narrative, Olonnais was the survivor of a massacre that swore vengeance upon the Spanish perpetrators. Becoming a Buccaneer captain in his own right, he'd earned the moniker Flail of the Spanish, ransacking the towns of Maracaibo, Gibraltar, and San Pedro. Known for his excessive cruelties, he engaged in such practices as cutting off flesh, burning people alive, and wounding them, tying ropes around their heads till the eyes popped out of their sockets. In his most notable episode, Olonnais cut open the chest of a Spanish prisoner, tore out his still-beating heart, and took a bite out of it. However, he was appropriately punished by the Guna people of Panama, who tore him limb from limb, burning his remains to ashes, so that nothing would remain of such a horrible person. It must first be noted that François l'Olonnais was not his real name, but a nickname, alias specifically. It literally means the Frenchman from Sable d'Olonne, a city on the French Atlantic coast. Another one of his common aliases was Capitaine François, the French captain, indicating his prominent status among the French pirates of Tortuga. It was common for the members of the Brethren of the Coast to adopt these monikers, keeping their true names secret from all but their close friends. His real name was Jean-David Nau, and he entered the world in 1630. We know little about his childhood or upbringing, apart from his place of birth. In his early 20s, he sold himself as an indentured servant to the French West India Company, and was shipped across the Atlantic to the Caribbean, landing on the island of Tortuga. Here he was purchased by a plantationer and served him dutifully for a 3-year term. It was during his service that he got to know the Buccaneers, the legendary hunters, known for their cured meat and marksmanship. He joined them as soon as he became a free man, first as a servant to a hunter, and then as a hunter himself. Ever since settling on Tortuga some 20 years prior, the Buccaneer had maintained a guerrilla conflict against the Spanish, and would often go on piratical excursions against their enemy. Being the restless character that he was, Olonnais soon turned to piracy, seemingly excelling at the practice. Having completed 2 or 3 expeditions, he was granted his own ship by the governor of Tortuga. He took many prizes, and soon earned a reputation among the Spanish for his excessive cruelty. Call it divine intervention, for Olonnais was soon shipwrecked on the coast of Campeche. Here he was discovered by the Spanish, who massacred all of his men, leaving Olonnais as the only survivor. To avoid detection, he had to smear himself with the blood of the fallen and hide among the bodies. When the enemy dispersed, he dressed himself with Spanish clothes and wandered until he encountered a group of slaves. He convinced them to abandon their master, steal a canoe, and join him to Tortuga. When he returned to Tortuga, Olonnais freed the slaves as promised. At least, that's what the French edition says. The other editions are silent on the matter. His only concern was to revenge himself on the Spanish. For this, he needed a proper ship, as he had nothing but the Spanish canoe at this point, and a second one he managed to acquire at some point after. He mustered a crew of 21 pirates and set off to nearby Cuba. Here he was discovered by fishermen who alerted the governor of his presence. The governor didn't believe them at first, having received news of Olonnais's death in Campeche. But he nevertheless sent out a small ship, a frigate according to the French, armed with 10 cannons and a crew of 90 strong men. Among them was a black slave, appointed as executioner by the governor, and ordered to hang all of the pirates, except for their captain, who was to be brought back to Havana. The fishermen relayed these news to Olonnais, hoping it would scare him off. Being so eager to acquire a new ship, it only had the opposite effect. Olonais found the frigate lying at the mouth of the river Estera, and he hid his 2 canoes in the trees along the riverbanks, one upon each side. The captured fishermen called out to the frigate, saying that the pirates had fled. But in the morning, the pirates announced their presence without revealing their location. The Spanish fired blindly into the opposite shorelines, and after 2 or 3 ineffective volleys, the pirates boarded the frigate, chasing all of the Spaniards below deck. Olonais let them come up one by one, and as soon as a head stuck out of the hatch, he cut it off. Having disposed of much of the crew in this fashion, the executioner came up, begging for mercy. He told Olonais of his orders. Olonais shrugged and kept capping off the Spaniards. He only spared a single man, giving him a letter and a word of warning. He would rather kill himself than hand himself over to the enemy, and no matter how many Spaniards he captured, he would spare none of them. All of it seems very convenient and certainly dramatic. You know, decapitating tens of Spaniards as they come up one by one through a hatch like a game of whack-a-mole. Being the sole survivor of a massacre, using Speech 100 to turn a group of slaves to his side. Possibly one of those legends spun in the seedy taverns of Tortuga by unsober sailors claiming to at least have sailed beneath his flag. More than one certainly claiming to be the sole survivor. All of this information can be traced back to one single source: Alexander Exquemelin's Buccaneers of America. Well, to be specific, the different editions of it. After its original Dutch publishing in 1678, it was subsequently translated and modified into German, Spanish, English, and French. Though I wasn't able to read all of them, I did work with a Swedish translation of the Dutch, and I used passages from the Dutch original for cross-referencing. Dutch is sort of intelligible with English, Swedish, and German. Ich spreche kleine Deutsch, so I can understand parts, but not all of it. And a Danish translation of the French. I can read some French, but Danish is basically the same as Swedish, and the Danish also has very good annotations. And finally, the original 1684 English translation, which isn't actually a translation of the Dutch original, but the Spanish one, with all of its obvious biases. Whew, that was a lot. All to say that these translations differ in some details. Like I said, the French said that Olonais freed the slaves and that the ship was a frigate. And though it doesn't agree with the Dutch on what specific regions Olonais sailed to in Cuba, it agrees that it was the northern coast. However, the Spanish and English agree with the name of the village close to the battle, but says that it was on the southern coast. But all of them say that the battle happened on a river named Estera. Looking at a modern map of Cuba, I was unable to find any river of that name. Cuba has multiple rivers, so perhaps the engagement happened at one of them, if it actually ever happened. It has always struck me as somewhat perplexing that, in spite of his popularity, most sources on Olonais can be traced back to only one source: Exquemelin. A pirate of this fame and notoriety would certainly have entire books dedicated to him, compiled from lengths of eyewitness accounts, journals, and government records. But in truth, there isn't much besides Exquemelin. A loose narrative can be constructed from some scattered testimonies in French and Spanish, mentioning a few of his individual assaults, but it isn't enough to draw a satisfying conclusion or paint a vivid picture of this man that has achieved such a colorful and horrifying reputation. Pretty much all of it can be owed to his chapters in Exquemelin. That begs the question, how reliable is Exquemelin? Can we trust anything he says? And if this single source cannot be trusted, does that mean that our image of François l'Olonais, this cannibalistic villain of pop culture, is entirely fabricated? History is a complicated topic, because it is always very difficult to determine what actually happened. Especially in the day and age before widespread access to cell phones and the internet. In this period, we are limited to written records. That is, what a small number of people, with their own intentions and biases, intentional or not, have to say or not say on a topic. The best determiner of the reliability of a written source is tracing their proximity to the described event. Were they actually there? In this case, did Exquemelin, our only extensive source on Ollonay, actually meet the pirate? It is possible. Exquemelin and Ollonay were both present on the island of Tortuga between November of 1666 and June of 1667. But Exquemelin was a plantation servant at this point, and I doubt a reputable captain like Ollonay would have wanted to interact with him intimately enough. Exquemelin was never part of Ollonay's crew, but since a lot of his information can be corroborated from sources he did not have access to, that is, Spanish documents, he must have gotten this information from members of Ollonay's crew. Exquemelin's first commander was a former officer of Ollonay, named Pierre Le Picard. This is actually better than what we're often left with. Some pirate biographies are based entirely on hearsay from half across the world, and some historical sources were based on oral retellings of events that transpired hundreds of years prior. It came to me in a dream, etc. But this doesn't make Exquemelin a reliable source, even though he frequently insists on his authenticity, and even admits uncertainties. Of course, this is a trick to make us trust him when he speaks more authoritatively on a subject, even if other sources can prove him plain wrong. One of the more interesting sources he cites is the alleged lone survivor of Ollonay's final capture. It is of course very convenient that just a single person managed to get out alive, and that Exquemelin managed to meet and talk with him directly. It is entirely possible, of course, but it's just as likely that this man was just a drunk hobo, or that Exquemelin doctored this alleged source in order to give credence to a fictional demise of Ollonay. Ollonay certainly did disappear in 1668, however, for someone with a moral message, a sudden disappearance is not exactly an appropriate ending. But why would Exquemelin just invent an ending for Ollonay? And what exactly was his moral message? To answer these questions, we firstly need some information on Exquemelin. Alexander Exquemelin is a bit mysterious himself. It is uncertain if he was a Dutch or Frenchman, with multiple historians believing he was born around 1645 in Honfleur, France, possibly to a Calvinist family. The only information he shares about himself in his book concerns his voyage to the West Indies. In 1666, he boarded a ship to Tortuga, where he sold himself as an indentured servant to a cruel master. His maltreatment resulted in a period of illness, which caused him to be sold to a surgeon, who took Exquemelin as an apprentice. After a period of training, this kind new master allowed Exquemelin to join a company of Buccaneers as their ship's surgeon, with the promise that he'd pay back the master. Exquemelin sailed with the Buccaneers, partaking in such campaigns as Panama, 1671, before finally leaving their service in 72, settling down in Amsterdam as a surgeon. However, it appears as though civilization could not hold him forever, for in 1697, his name appears as a surgeon in the muster rolls of the 84-gun Scepter, a man-of-war that partook in the 1697 sack of Cartagena. It is not known when he died, but he seems to have still been active 10 years later. However, Exquemelin is today remembered almost exclusively for his book, the Amerikanske zee-roovers, better known in English by its 1684 translation, The Buccaneers of America. It mustn't be understated how influential this book has been, not only in the history of pirates, but also in our pop culture understanding of them. This book was radical in that it was the first comprehensive account of the exploits of the Buccaneers, a seafaring group of paramilitaries that harassed Spanish possessions in the 17th century. Spain back then was essentially at war with everyone, so France and England saw the Buccaneers as a necessary evil to expand their colonial empires. Whenever the Buccaneers did appear in published records, their crimes tended to be sanitized. Exquemelin broke the mold by portraying the Buccaneers as shockingly barbarous, being only motivated by riches, which they hastily spent on drinking and whoring, and being well accustomed to wanton torture, murder, and rape. This account received mixed reactions. In the Low Countries and Germany, it was quite popular. The Spanish translation decided to expand on the crimes against the Spanish, whilst glorifying their own side, whereas the English translations were actually not translations from the Dutch original, but the Spanish edition. Even though it included all the horrors of the Spanish edition, the translation made by William Crook, appropriate name, still sought to glorify the English Buccaneers, especially their leader, Henry Morgan. Crook is a really peculiar figure. I've heard his behavior described as schizophrenic, because he never seemed to be aware of how damning the book actually was against the Buccaneers, Morgan, and the English ambitions abroad. On the other hand, a second translation by Thomas Malthus exaggerated both the appraisals and the cruelties, in order to highlight the horrors of English imperialism. As for Henry Morgan himself, he wasn't so happy about all of this, and sued both of the publishers for libel. Crook made a profuse apology, basically polishing Morgan's main-yard, if you catch my drift, even though he barely made any effective changes to his translation, whereas Malthus just paid the money and made no comment. Morgan couldn't save his reputation, however, and subsequent reprints would continue to portray him as essentially a monster, with the publishers caring for nothing but money. It's interesting, but a bit off topic. Malthus' exaggerated vision seems to have been more in line with Exquemelin's intentions, which were anti-imperialist, and critical of both the Spanish, English, and French. Some English readers highlighted the hypocrisy of a Dutchman smearing their imperialism, while remaining silent on the cruelties committed by his own nation in the East Indies, but that's a whataboutism. According to Exquemelin, colonial empires are built on violence. They are obtained through violent conquest and maintained through brutal suppression. The Spanish arrived in the Americas, killed the natives who resisted, and tortured the rest until they submitted. This was a widely accepted fact in the 17th century, and twisted by Spain's enemies into a propaganda narrative called the Black Legend. Basically, atrocities against the natives was used to justify imperialist action against the Spanish. It was often used as an excuse by the Buccaneers, as colonial governors sponsored their brutal attacks on Spanish territory, murdering those who resisted, torturing civilians until they revealed their treasure, and had their fun with the rest. And according to Exquemelin, this brutality went against the word of God. Exquemelin was a deeply religious person. This is evident in his writing. It is clear that he believed God would directly interfere in mortal affairs by administering punishments according to eye for an eye. For example, he shares the anecdote of an abused servant begging for God to punish his master. The master is accordingly punished. This theme of karma being a witch resonates through his entire narrative. This can even be seen on the frontispiece of the original Dutch edition. On the left side we can see images of Spaniards committing crimes upon the natives. On the right side, Buccaneers commit the same crimes against the Spaniards. The Buccaneers became a tool of divine justice, the hammer which God uses to smite the Spanish for their cruelty against the natives. In many examples, Exquemelin tells us how the Buccaneers tortured the Spanish, with Spanish methods previously used against natives. A very effective literary device. But in turn, the Buccaneers are likewise punished for their cruelties. Remember the brutal death of Oloney at the hands of the Guna. Of this people, Exquemelin writes in the final chapter on Oloney, "But God Almighty, the time of his divine justice being now come, had appointed the Indians of Darien to be the instruments and executioners thereof." Now, critiquing the Spanish Empire and even the Buccaneers wasn't anything unique to Exquemelin or translators like Malthus. But Exquemelin didn't stop there. He doesn't just single out the Spanish. His work is a critique of all colonial empires. He makes it clear how dependent the colonial officials of France and England are on the Buccaneers to expand their imperial ambitions. He notes how even the King of England tacitly sponsored the Buccaneers and governors involved in their atrocities, since they were beneficial to English colonialism. Much like how the Spanish had taken and subjugated their empire by force, so did the English. But Exquemelin doesn't just stop at the Buccaneers as a tool of imperialism, showing instead how violence and suppression radiates through the very foundations of the empire. English Jamaica was heavily dependent on indentured servitude, which Exquemelin likens to the Buccaneers' own brutal treatment of their servants, which Exquemelin experienced personally. His tool of critique is to establish an intrinsic link between all of these forces, and showing that the empires are no better than the barbarous Buccaneers they employ, but have tried to sweep under the rug. Again, his account was really the first one to expose this problem. That brings us back to Olonais, his poor documentation, and his role in the book. The primary purpose of Olonais' chapter is not to give an accurate account of the man, but rather to present him as a link between Spanish cruelty and the actions of Henry Morgan. In the chronology of Exquemelin's book, the Caribbean cycle of bloodshed begins with the Spanish abusing the natives, and then the French settlers on Tortuga. These settlers in turn become the Buccaneers, the disorganized hunters, frontiersmen, and pirates that oppose the Spanish. These Buccaneers in turn become full-time marauders, the Buccaneers, who are then employed by the French and English to construct their colonial empires. So, when Exquemelin introduces Olonais as a character, he tells us how he started out as an indentured servant. He inherits the cruelty of his masters and the Spanish. He then goes on to commit cruelties upon the Spanish. Henry Morgan is presented as the scion of Olonais. Exquemelin writes the following: Captain Henry Morgan, who may deservedly be called the second Olonais, not being unlike or inferior to him, either in achievements against the Spaniards or in robberies of many innocent people. It all becomes very convenient to Exquemelin's narrative, so in all likelihood, large parts of it were invented. The gaps were filled in. In my opinion, we can't really speak of Olonais as a true historical figure. We can only know for certain that he attacked a number of ships and places, but so little is actually known about him as a person that he is as much a fictional character. But is this actually a negative? Should we antagonize Exquemelin? Did he actually do anything wrong? I don't think so. Let me explain why. The problem with Olonais doesn't lie with Exquemelin, rather the popular interpretation. People have come to view Olonais as some sort of exception. He is the cruel pirate, the cruelest pirate, whereas Exquemelin seemingly intended to use a poorly documented and semi-legendary person to highlight the excessive cruelties endemic to the Caribbean. Olonais not only became the manifestation of the Buccaneers, but of colonialism. So of course he had to be excessively cruel. But the point isn't that he is the cruel one. The point is that all of the Buccaneers were cruel, and that the empires in turn were cruel. Olonais as an individual doesn't really matter. The point of this discussion is not to exonerate him. He was a Buccaneer, and certainly did commit the cruelties expected of this profession. He was not a good person. The point is that he wasn't exceptional. And this is not a bad message. That is really why I cannot blame Exquemelin, especially when he wrote his book in an entirely different time period, when the scientific method had not even been fully conceptualized. People simply did not view history the way we do today. Before the Enlightenment, and especially the 19th century, history was more so seen as a tool to deliver messages and intentions. It was allegorical, essentially fairy tales. Like how Hansel and Gretel is about, kids, don't enter the houses of strangers. Ideology, history, religion, and morality were much more intertwined back then, almost to the point of being one and the same. The Bible was seen as a historical work of fact, and the Christian structure of the Heavenly Father ruling over creation was a mirror of the monarchies, who ruled with divine providence. History, ideology, and religion were all connected with the joint purpose of understanding, changing, and controlling people in the here and now. They didn't care how we would read their books 400 years from then. Even then, I can respect Exquemelin in that he had the stirrings of a modern historian. and certainly had an awareness of the effect which the manipulation of history and narratives has. This becomes apparent when he presents multiple versions of the same narrative. Whereas colonial documents portray their exploits as entirely glorious and one-sided, Exquemelin included more nuance. When retelling the Spanish reconquest of English-occupied Santa Catalina, he first recounts how it was taken without much resistance. But he then includes a Spanish account, which was much more violent, the Spaniards valiantly defeating the defiant Buccaneers. A few years later, when Henry Morgan occupies the island, Exquemelin satirizes this with an account of how the Spanish garrison actually surrendered, but since they didn't want to appear this way in official documents, agreed with Morgan to host a mock battle in which both sides fired blanks at each other, thus allowing them to tell their superiors, "We did our courageous best, but were ultimately defeated, but honorably." So even if Exquemelin certainly employs many literary embellishments, he still appears critical of this twisting of history to confuse and propagandize, the favorite methods of tyrants and of pirates. The latter were dependent on poor documentation. They would often destroy books and documents detailing their crimes, falsify narratives glorifying them, or legends able to terrify their opponents into submission in order to prosper. Piracy declined with books like Exquemelin's and the advent of the colonial printing press, which could publish first-hand accounts of Buccaneer and piratical crimes, thus showing their readers how terrible these scalawags actually were. The parallel to our modern day is indisputable. Tyrannical governments are dependent on falsified narratives, glorifications, sweeping their crimes under the rug, or just causing confusion to discourage people from taking action. In the eyes of a dictator, the best citizen is the one who is not involved. This is why the modern scientific approach to history is so important. The use of multiple sources and voices, constant discussion, critique and revisioning. The truth is difficult, if not impossible, to achieve, so we have to do our best to come as close as possible. We need to be informed in order to make informed decisions. So yeah, you probably did not expect this type of discussion from this type of video, but I think this is the crux of François l'Olonnais. He is a poorly documented Buccaneer captain who was embellished as a literary device to highlight the cruelty endemic to colonialism. Even still, I'm sure a lot, if not most of you, came here purely to hear his story. Even if some of you may have appreciated this bit, which I think is important, not only for the broader societal implications, but also for understanding the story of Olonnais. Because now that we look at his story, we know that we should take it with a bit of salt, and we can better know how to notice embellishments. With that said, these videos will always be niche content that struggle to get recognized in the algorithm. At the same time, I am dependent on views in order to keep producing videos. So, if you want to see more pirate content in the future, it is crucial that you give the video a like and share your thoughts in the comments section. And maybe even click the subscribe button and notification bell. And channel memberships, donations and Patreon support helps immensely, like you wouldn't believe. Anyway, let's wind back the clock to the alleged life of Olonnais. We are once again back in the Caribbean, Olonnais having just taken the Spanish frigate in Cuba. Olonnais arrived on Tortuga in 1650 or 1653. He served his term as a servant for 3 years, was then a hunter for an unidentified number of years, before becoming a pirate and, at least according to Exquemelin, went through the misadventure of the first segment. All we know for certain is that by 1666, he had become one of the most notorious pirates on the island of Tortuga. Bearing the title of Admiral, he was able to recruit a force of 660 filibusters and hunters, among them another reputable buccaneer named Michel Le Basque. Although Le Basque isn't as notorious today, he was kind of a star back in the 1600s, and shrouded in significant mystery. It is said that he had military experience in Europe, had partaken in the earliest actions on Tortuga, that he plundered 1,000,000 piastres from a Spanish galleon, and while some say that he died in 1668, Others claim he was present in the sack of Veracruz 16 years later. Nonetheless, in 66, Exquemelin said he had amassed enough booty to live in comfort, and had been appointed as Major of Tortuga. Still, Arne managed to sway him to his side, appointing him as commander of the land forces, and he was able to acquire a commission from the governor. Having mustered his army and a fleet of 8 small vessels, the Cuban frigate not amongst them, suspicious, Arne set sail for the Spanish Main. Their target was Lake Maracaibo in modern-day Venezuela, since he had prisoners familiar with the area, who agreed to provide him with intelligence. The plan was to conquer the city of Maracaibo on the entrance of the lake, only to enter that body of water and plunder every settlement on its shorelines. On the eastern tip of Hispaniola, he captured a Spanish vessel after a 2-hour-long fight, taking a cargo of cacao, gold, and jewels. It was sent back to Tortuga to offload its plunder and fill up with provisions and reinforcements, replacements for those who had been killed or wounded. Whilst the fleet waited for the ship's return at Savona, they captured another Spanish ship, this one bearing salaries for the garrison of Santo Domingo. They took it without firing a single shot. When the first prize returned with new men and provisions, Arne took her as his flagship, and gave his Cuban ship to his old friend, Antoine de Puy. However, the Spanish sources do not mention any such large vessels. Instead, they describe the fleet that attacked Maracaibo as consisting of 2 ketches and 6 sloops. Nevertheless, the pirates continued. As an interesting side note, Exquemelin spends a large part of his chapter documenting the economy and nature of Maracaibo and its settlements. He relates a story told to him by a Spaniard of a people living in the mountains who have short, curly hair and long claws on their feet, and are strong, excellent climbers. The Spaniards attempted to kill them, but their skins were able to deflect arrows and sharp weapons. They would kill the Spanish by carrying them into trees and dropping them to the ground, and they would apparently come down from the mountains, raiding plantations to carry off the slave women. Exquemelin said he had never seen such a people, but believed them to be a type of ape. Stories of monkey men aside, Arne landed his troops on a beach close to Maracaibo, intending to conquer the defenses on the mouth of the lake. These were feeble, consisting only of 16 cannons, surrounded by several gabions, with a ramp of earth thrown against them to shelter the men inside. Arne and his vanguard overran the fortifications, incurring no losses. By hoisting their colors, they signaled for the ships to enter the lake, as they sabotaged the defenses by burning the gun carriages and spiking the cannons. The next day, they assaulted the city itself. The ships provided a barrage, while the main force made landfall in their canoes. However, fire was not returned. As it turned out, the fleeing Spanish had alerted the city, telling them that an army of 2,000 pirates had arrived, making everyone flee with their riches. However, they had left behind their food and alcohol, allowing the pirates to have their fill. They had lived on sea rations and with barely any booze for close to a month. For a pirate, this was near impossible. Each crew occupied a house in the center of town, with the Col du Garde erected in the church. Guards were posted, and a troop of 500 were sent out to find the refugees. They managed to capture a number of men, women, and children, torturing them to reveal the location of treasure. Arne apparently drew his cutlass and hacked a Spaniard to pieces in front of the others, saying he would do the same to each and every one of them, should they not tell him what they knew. One of them relented and promised to show him where the other Spaniards had hid. But those in hiding realized that the pirates would learn of their location, so every day they moved to a different spot and managed to avoid detection. After 2 weeks of occupying Maracaibo, Arne proceeded to nearby Gibraltar, the center of the cacao trade. Here we encounter our first significant clash between the sources, as the Spanish records differ significantly from Exquemelin's account. According to Exquemelin, Gibraltar had been alerted and reinforced by 400 soldiers and 400 armed locals, totaling to a force of 800. They were led by the governor himself, a veteran of the 8 Years' War, who erected a battery of 20 cannons along the shoreline and a redoubt of 8. The pirates saw these entrenchments, but Olonais promised his council that the greater the fight, the greater the plunder, and that he himself would lead the vanguard. If anyone would prove a coward, he'd shoot them himself. At dawn, the Buccaneers made landfall. They took each other by the hand and swore an oath to stand each other by, Olonais declaring, "Allons mes frères, suivez-moi et ne faites point les lâches." "Come on, my brothers, follow me and don't be cowards." Then they marched. Following a guide, they came upon a road which had been blocked, and were forced to wade through a swampland where the Spanish had set up an ambush. The pirates had to draw their cutlasses and cut off vegetation to prevent themselves from sinking into the swamp, all the while being unable to see or hear each other from the smoke and Spanish cannonballs whistling by them. They finally reached one of the fortifications, where the Spanish fired upon them and sallied out, but were forced back by the pirates. A standstill ensued, the pirates unable to take the trenches, and the Spanish not daring to attack. Olonais decided to employ a ruse. He made a fake retreat, drawing the Spaniards out of their comfort, after which he counterattacked. The Buccaneers fired a mass volley, drew their cutlasses, and charged the hapless enemy. Using their bodies as ladders, they scaled the defenses, forcing the rest to retreat. These they pursued into the woodlands, butchering them as they went. They entered Gibraltar, where they forced the prisoners into the church, and constructed their own breastwork to defend against a possible counterattack, which never came. The battle was over. At least, according to Exquemelin. The Spanish records present a different story. For one, they say that Olonais did not make his first landing at Gibraltar, but attempted instead Puerto de las Barbacoas, 20 miles away. His intention was to use this spot as a staging ground to flank Gibraltar, but he met with resistance from Paraute auxiliaries. As the pirates rowed for the shore, the Paraute archers pelted the canoes with a storm of arrows, terrifying them so much that they fled back to their ships. Olonais was forced to a direct assault. As the fleet approached the settlement, the batteries opened fire, starting an artillery duel that would last for a whole 8 days. It was one of the bloodiest battles involving Buccaneers. About 40 crewmen were killed and 30 wounded, but the defenders suffered even heavier casualties. After a few days, corpses littered the streets, the buildings damaged. Among the casualties was the governor, anonymous to Exquemelin, but known to the Spanish as Gabriel Guerrero de Sandoval. His death had a significant effect on morale, and the Spanish decided to abandon their homes. As the Buccaneers made landfall, they were able to occupy the town without any resistance. A vanguard was sent out into the countryside, occupying a ranch where they tortured 2 of the guards. These revealed the location of the town's hidden treasures, taking silver, valuables, and a significant number of slaves. They spent the rest of the month occupying the town, torturing the locals to discover more treasure, raping women, some of whom prostituted themselves for food. The pirates refused to feed their prisoners. There was plenty of flour, but the pirates were too lazy to bake, sustaining themselves entirely on meat. So when the prisoners began to starve, they fed the mules and donkeys, dining themselves on chicken, pigs, cows, and sheep. It was customary for pre-modern armies to demand a ransom for the cities they captured, usually amassed by the denizens to prevent their homes from being burned. The people of Gibraltar were unable to pay the ransom, and at the end of July 1666, the pirates put the city to the torch. They also burned a shipyard, from which they captured 2 prizes, one of which became Olonais' new flagship. They returned to Maracaibo, finding that the denizens had returned. They threatened to burn the city, demanding a ransom in return. The people were unable to pay in money, but offered instead a herd of 500 cattle. It took almost 10 days to assemble, deliver, and slaughter the cows. They had to be cut and preserved on the spot, lest they rot in the climate. Bad weather further delayed the departure, and the fleet could not leave until late September. The fleet landed on Ile de Vache, Cow Island, a popular resting stop for Buccaneers. According to Exquemelin, the company divided their loot here without any issues. However, multiple eyewitnesses, both French and Spanish, claim otherwise. According to them, a dispute arose on whether they should divide their loot here or sell the captured slaves and add the proceeds to the loot before dividing it. They settled on the latter, sailed to Gonavey, where the slaves were offloaded and sent to the burgeoning slave market to the south. By late October, the payment was received and the shares divided. After this, the company split up, the English returning to Jamaica, the French Tortuga. Some of them took a few slaves for themselves. Interestingly, some of these slaveholders were former slaves themselves, Mayans and other Native Americans that had been enslaved, since escaped or liberated by the Buccaneers, and now slave masters themselves. Arne sold one of his prize ships, an 80-ton 12-gun brigantine, to Gerrit Gerritsson and Jules de Lecat, two other notorious Buccaneers, before entering Tortuga in triumph. Visually speaking, I think Arne is one of the most iconic Buccaneers, and you have undoubtedly seen this original illustration where he brandishes a cutlass over his shoulder, standing against a background of sinking ships and burning settlements, undoubtedly at his hand. Whilst most pirate woodcuts were seemingly made without much knowledge of what the subject actually looked like, there is reason to believe that this image is close to reality. The first French edition is prefaced by a note from Exquemelin, saying that he had a hand in developing the illustrations. It seems that he was a good draftsman that made sketches of the things and people he saw in the Caribbean. Even though none of these pictures have survived, they would have been used as source material for the illustrations of the Dutch edition. Subsequent editions and translations made copies of it. Of course, it is debatable if Exquemelin ever met Arne personally. Both of them were present on the island of Tortuga between October 1666 and June of 1667. But would the indentured servant of a plantationer really have met or even seen the most reputable filibuster commander? Maybe, maybe not. On the illustration, Arne is a short-haired man with a thin moustache. This was fashionable throughout the entire century, and a style sported by filibusters and hunters in eyewitness illustrations made a few years later. His clothes are also of interest. He has a jacket with cut arms, a style very fashionable in the early to mid-17th century. It is a very fanciful dress, however. When sailing and campaigning, he possibly would have worn something more durable and practical. This outfit may have been reserved for R&R on Tortuga. Of interesting note is that Barbossa in the POTC franchise wears a coat with a similar style. According to Exquemelin, most of the Buccaneers spent their plunder in just 3 days. Being short on cash, they turn again to their old commander, the man from Arne. It might have been an exaggeration. Though Exquemelin is bad at providing dates, the records confirm that Arne returned from Maracaibo in October of 1666. He departed the island in June of the next year. By the merit of success and astounding reputation, Arne raised a new company of 600 to 700 men, 300 crowded aboard his 28-gun flagship, and followed by 5 smaller vessels. The fleet gathered at Baja on Hispaniola, where the hunters gathered and cured meat for their provisioning. Their target was Lake Nicaragua, Arne hoping to repeat the success of John Morris and Henry Morgan 2 years prior. They had sacked a number of lucrative targets along the shoreline, Granada most prominently, and some of the participating Buccaneers were now part of Arne's company. Most prominently, the aforementioned native slaveholders, including Juan Gallardo, a pilot enslaved by the Spanish after being convicted of murder. The lake is connected to the Caribbean Sea via the San Juan River, which now forms the natural border between modern Nicaragua and Costa Rica. However, his flagship would be unable to enter this river, so the pirates first went to Cuba to acquire native canoes. They cruised along the southern coast, entering the Gulf of Batabanó, stealing the vessels from indigenous turtle fishers. The Spanish would later retaliate by seizing French and English turtlers in the Cayman Islands. Some of the fishermen were likewise press-ganged into Ollonay's company, serving the pirates as slave laborers. From there they sailed south, across the Caribbean Sea, to Honduras. At the northern tip, they captured an English vessel, bound for the illegal logwood trade in Mexico. This capture is quite peculiar. The French and English buccaneers would usually leave the respective nation alone, as they were usually allies against the Spanish, and the logwood cutters were heavily involved in piracy themselves.
Bloody pirates!
The fleet continued towards Nicaragua, but were unable to proceed to San Juan owing to bad winds. They almost came to a complete standstill. The weather was unbearable and provisions were running low. A frustrated Ollonay was forced to sally out in 2 canoes up the Aguan River, looting native villages of their corn, poultry, and supplies. Undoubtedly, many of these communities were reduced to starvation. In September of 1667, Ollonay led a shore party of 350 against Puerto de Caballos, a small settlement of a few huts. The warehouse was ransacked, and the pirates set up a garrison led by Dutchman Moses van Klein. Ollonay forced 2 mulattoes to guide him to San Pedro, located 30 miles inland. On his way, he pillaged the habitations of the native Tolupan, carving a bloody trail of destruction. As the Buccaneers marched through the jungle, hacking the vegetation with their cutlasses, they were ambushed by a body of Spanish militia. The fight was brief, Ollonay victorious, but the captives revealed that further ambushes lay ahead. Ollonay pulled one of the Spaniards aside and asked if there was a way around. He said no. Ollonay took him before the rest, asking them the same question. All of them said no. According to Exquemelin, Ollonay was so angered by this that he tore open the chest of one of the prisoners, pulled out his still-beating heart, took a bite out of it, and throwing it in the face of one of the other men, said, "If you do not show me another way, I'll do the same to you." This is the most notorious episode from the life of Ollonay, usually recounted in the headings, titles, introductory bits, etc. to articles on Ollonay. However, as you can guess, it was only ever told by Exquemelin. Owing to Spanish eyewitness accounts, we have a good understanding of Ollonay's campaign in Honduras, and though they can attest to his attacks and trail of destruction, there seems to be no mention of this heart-eating episode, which surely would have been of scandalous interest. Whilst the cannibalism episode serves a purpose in drawing attention to Ollonay, who might otherwise have been an obscure figure like so many other interesting buccaneers, the problem is that it becomes such a defining trait as to divert attention from his more mundane but confirmed atrocities. He tortured prisoners, enslaved native peoples, stole food from their villages, and probably reduced many of them to starvation. But this was not exceptional in the period. All pirates behaved in this manner, as did regular armies, who sustained themselves on plunder. So by highlighting Ollonay as some figure of exceptional cruelty, other pirates and colonial actors, and period armies as a whole, are somewhat exonerated. Being desperate for provisions, the Buccaneers had no choice but to press on. The terrified prisoner agreed to show an alternate path, but it was totally unusable, and the Buccaneers were forced to the main road. In anger, Ollonay allegedly exclaimed, "Mordieu, le bougre d'Espagnol me le paieront! Death of God, the Spanish buggers shall pay for this!" Bugger meaning a sodomite, usually a homosexual male, or the 17th century equivalent of the 6-letter F word. The desperate pirates pressed on, enduring more and more ambushes. The Spanish were hoping to exhaust them, and would continuously retreat to the next position. Ollonay told his men to show no mercy, as it would make the city fight easier. Eventually, they reached San Pedro, finding it surrounded by thorny bushes, impenetrable like barbed wire. They were forced to circumvent it, running into proper barricades. The Spanish opened fire. Arne and his men had to lay flat to avoid the cannons, and after the first salvo, they returned fire with their muskets, threw in grenades, but were unable to take the barricade. After sustaining heavy casualties, they were finally able to press inside, until they were certain not to miss. The Spaniards hoisted a flag of truce, and according to Exquemelin, Arne gave them 2 hours to pack up and run. When the 2 hours had passed, he sent out his vanguard to catch them, taking them prisoner. The town had been abandoned by its denizens, so Arne looted the vicinity of food and provisions, before setting fire to San Pedro and returning to the coast. The pirate garrison had learned that the Honduras ship was coming to Puerto de Caballos, also known as the Honduras Hulk. This was a small galleon that traveled independently of the treasure fleet between Spain and Honduras. Its predictable route and minor defenses made it a lucrative target for pirate attacks. Arne posted a couple of lookout boats on the southern shore, before crossing to the western side to careen his ships. Bast was collected from the Macao tree and made into ropes and oakum, and they made pitch from shark oil and a strange black substance washed up on the shore. Turtles were their primary foodstuff. The ships were careened swiftly, after which they went up and down the shore in canoes, searching for ambergris and natives hoping to trade with the Hulk. The pirates were growing impatient. Arne would have to act soon, as his men would abandon him. After 3 months of waiting, the Hulk finally arrived in November of 1667. A fierce fight ensued. The Hulk was armed with 42 guns and 130 men, and the pirates were beaten back, including a smaller ship and Arne's own flagship. Using the gunsmoke as cover, 4 canoes were able to board the Hulk and take it. A few days later, they captured a frigate from Havana in a bloody engagement. However, the booty had proven unsatisfying after the long wait, and the campaign had already been dragged out for too long. According to Exquemelin, half of the company departed at this point. This might not have been the case, because according to eyewitnesses, the pirate fleet sailed together to Belize, seemingly to repair and refit their ships after the battle. At a small island called Abraham's Cay, they were able to establish amicable relations with Mayan fishermen. It probably helped that Arne had a number of Mayans in his crew, as aforementioned. The Buccaneers bought foodstuffs in return for metal tools and raw iron, looted from the Spanish ship. At this point, the Mayans had learned to rework metal obtained from visitors. The two sides became so close that the Tipu Mayans sent emissaries, asking the Buccaneers to join them in their attack on a rival nation, possibly the Itza. They suggested that the inland population was quite wealthy, and after defeating them, the Spanish towns of Guatemala lay open to conquest. Arne declined, seemingly not trusting the Mayans. However, scouting parties were sent out to find the provincial capital of Merida, but were unable to do so. They took out their frustration on the locals, raiding 2 villages of their food and taking 14 captives. These managed to escape, and relations soured. After 5 months, Arne departed. The company was displeased over Arne's lack of success. They had been on campaign for a year now, with nothing but 2 prizes to show for it. According to Exquemelin, the Hulk had even offloaded most of its cargo after being warned of the pirates' presence, and most of its iron had been given to the Mayans in return for food. While anchored at Gracias a Dios, Arne and his men encountered a fleet of Henry Morgan, intending to take on turtles before proceeding to Portobello. Half of his company decided to either join Morgan or go off on their own, including his lieutenants, Moses Van Klein, Pierre Le Picard, and Michel Le Basque, all of whom had been given their own ships. Left with a company of 300 and the Hulk as his new flagship, Arne managed to wreck it at the Pearl Islands. His crew were forced to make landfall, cutting the shipwreck apart to build a new boat. While doing so, they began planting crops to sustain themselves: beans, maize, bananas, and plantains. After several months, the boat was finished, and they had additionally acquired 7 canoes. But these were not enough to accommodate the entire company, so Olaney took 112 of them, and departed with the promise that he'd acquire a proper ship. These plans never came to fruition, as Olaney was ambushed at the mouth of the San Juan River by a Spanish militia, forewarned of his coming. 28 filibusters perished in the skirmish, including Olaney's second-in-command, Antoine Dupuy. 4 of his men were captured and taken to Granada and interrogated. The remainder panicked and fled into the jungle by foot. This is where Olaney disappears from the historical records, at least as far as I know. Exquemelin is the only source we have of his fate, apparently retold by a sole survivor. Olaney was captured by the Guna people of Darien, an instrument of the Lord, according to Exquemelin, delegated to punish this vile sinner for his crimes against God's creation. They tore Olaney to pieces and roasted the remains. Again, it is convenient and befitting of Exquemelin's moral message. The Spanish abused the natives, so Olaney punished the Spanish. But, as he became excessive and abused the natives, so too was he punished. There is also the motif of his remains being roasted. The Buccan grill, used by hunters like Olaney to cure their meat, the most common Buccaneer provision, was learned from Caribbean natives. According to the Black legend, the Spanish roasted natives alive on spits, and this technique was then used on the Spanish by the Buccaneers. Some woodcuts show them using Buccans for this purpose. And then Olaney would meet the same fate. It is quite literary. Never again do we hear from Olaney, the mysterious but infamous Buccaneer. He met great success at Maracaibo, but his downfall was equal in weight, and he vanished without a trace. So ends our story. If you enjoyed this episode, you might enjoy this in-depth look into the Buccaneer, the legendary hunters and frontiersmen that Olaney worked with. Or one of my many biographies on names known and unknown from the golden age of pirates. Enjoy. A lot of you watching engage in various forms of creative endeavors, ranging from novel writing to game design. Some of you have expressed interest or contacted me for consultation in your projects. So with the advice from one of my clients, I have set up a Fiverr account where you can now hire me to consult on your project. I offer research, proofreading, editing, and critique. Or we can just spitball ideas. You'll find a link in the video description or pinned comment below. Otherwise, support Golden Gunpowder by liking the video, giving your thoughts on the video, subscribing, and clicking the notification bell. Monetarily by buying some merch or becoming a Patreon supporter, where $1 a month gets you early, ad-free, and sponsor-free access to my videos.